Hey everybody, welcome to a quick little video here about functions in C++. I'm going to cover a couple of different sort of basic things about functions, and so hopefully you'll be able to use them in your programs after this. Functions in general for C++ are about bundling code together under a name. That you can more easily do than the code that you want to sort of bundle. Maybe I have like a menu or a complicated math equation that I want to use over and over in my program, or it has a lot of code associated with it, and I'd like to just sort of say like, hey, here's the menu, and the rest of it's sort of hidden, so once I have it all sort of figured out, it'd be nice to not have to look at it every time when I'm solving other parts of my program. So that's one way to sort of think about functions. It collects code and makes it easy to use. It's also really great for sharing your code. So if your code's organized in functions, it makes other people able to read your code really easily, and then they can say, oh, what does the roll 2 dice function do? Oh, and you can go down and look what that code does really clearly, and then maybe you can share that to somebody else, or they can borrow it from you. So functions kind of have 3 spots that they show up. So if I highlight this in my code, you can see that the first time we see kind of our function and stuff associated with it is right above the main, and then we also see it below the main down here, and then we actually use it inside the main. So this is about as simple of a function we can do. We make it, we use it, and we define it down here. So up top we call this declaring the function. It's telling the C++ compiler that, hey, we're making a custom function. It's not one of the ones that's already included in C++, like sine or cosine or square root or something like that. It's one that we're gonna make. And then down here we call this the define, and this is where we actually say what our custom function does. This function seems very simple, right? It contains one cout statement. You can put as many lines of code in between these brackets as you want to make it as robust as you want. And we'll see some different variations of that in a second. All functions have 3 parts. The first is the return type. The second is the name of the function. And the third is inside these parentheses is whether it takes any inputs or parameters. Sometimes we call them inputs, sometimes we call them parameters, sometimes we call them arguments. But it's basically, if you think about like sort of a math function or something like that, it's like maybe you'd send an integer in, or maybe you'd send a list of things in. It's just what your function needs to work from the outside. So this one is a function that's type void. It's the simplest kind of function. So void is a way to tell C++ that this function doesn't send anything back. We call that returning a value. It doesn't return a value. It just sort of does something. There's nothing that this function does that sort of turns into a variable that needs to be caught by a variable somewhere in the main, or used like a variable there. So this is going to be a void. Why is it a void? Well, in this case, I'm just doing a cout. Cout goes to the console. There's no variables or anything like that at all, so it doesn't need to return any values. So we give it a void. I gave it a name called welcome message because that's what it's doing. It's saying welcome to my program, and I called it welcome message so I could really tell what it did later on. You'll also notice that I used camel case to do my function. There's other ways to do your function naming, but I like camel case because one, I'm used to it, and 2, it's clear. I can easily tell what this does. Welcome message. And then this doesn't take any special inputs. It's just a function that does a thing. Down here, I just basically repeat the thing. Because I don't have any inputs, there's no real change down here. I tell it what I want it to do, and then I use it right here. So when I run it, says welcome to my program. Great. When we use functions, we always type out their name, and then we always use the parentheses, even if we're not going to, if we don't have any inputs. That's one of the things that tells the compiler that this is the function welcome message rather than like a variable with the welcome message name. So it's really important to remember those parentheses when you're using them. So now I'm going to introduce another function, and this one is going to return a value. So let me type it in real quick. I'm going to say, this one's called get username. Hopefully you can guess what it's going to do based on my nice naming. So this is going to have some code that's going to get the username, and then it's going to send it back to my program as a string. So let's do the actual code for this. And hopefully you'll see how maybe in like another program you've written, like where this code would have lived before. So I have get username, and I'm going to copy in my function that I've typed off screen. And I made a little note. I said this is a function that has no parameters but returns a value of type string. Exactly, because it doesn't have anything in here. Now notice that we did make a variable inside this function. So this function is pretty straightforward. It says make a variable called name. It's type string. I print out a message that says please tell me your name, and then I use the getLine command. So getLine is kind of like fancy cin. It lets you get everything that they type in, even if they include spaces. Cin sort of stops at spaces. GetLine would let me type in like Chris Bartlow with a space in there, and it'll grab it all, and then it saves it into name. Okay. Notice the other reason I did this is getLine is a built-in function of C++. That is part of the IOStream library. So I'm using a function. It takes in two things. It takes in the cin operator, and it takes in the variable you want to store it. So when it does that, it copies whatever they type in into name, and then I can return the name. I can send it to some other part of my program. So why would I do that? Well, I want to have up in my main, maybe I have something here where I declare a variable called username, and then I want to get a value for it. Well, I can just call my function right here, get username, and then it'll run this code down here. When it finishes, it'll send name and copy it in here. Okay, so that's pretty cool. It's very handy. Now, anytime I need to get somebody's name, I can just say get username, and like that saved me like a few lines of code, and it certainly makes this nice and tidy. All right, so we're really making things hopefully a little bit more simple. So that's an example of something that doesn't take a parameter, but returns a value. Now you might ask, well, wait a second, this got some input. Doesn't that mean there should be something up here? And that's a good question. And the reason that I did this specific example is that all of the values and variables that were sort of created were created with inside this function. Nothing needed to come from outside this function to work. I didn't need to send it the username so that then it could return it back, because I just needed to get the name and send it back. So it makes it a little bit tidier. We want to try to avoid making taking inputs that we don't need up here to keep our things simple. Couple of things, just other small things, is this is notice that I used, this is called the variable name, and this ends up being called username. They don't have to match, and it's actually usually better if they don't match. The reason that it doesn't matter if they match or not is that this isn't returning like the thing name. It's not sending back name, it's sending back the value that's stored in name. So remember we talked about variables kind of being buckets. This sort of like tosses the bucket, like the stuff in the bucket, and then this sort of catches that stuff when it comes back. And that's a lot what returning is. It's kind of this throwing and catching, and now I'm going to put it in a different place. So the last function we're going to do is one that actually takes in a value. And so in this case, I am going to say goodbye. And now that I've welcomed and I've gotten the username, I want to say goodbye, but I want to say goodbye to that specific person. So now I'm going to send it a value to use. And so let's go down here and add in this. So this is called a void function that takes in one parameter as an input. So again, it's going to be a void because I'm just doing some counting, but I really need that name that I got from somewhere else in my program. And I don't have to ask them to type in their name again because that's silly, I already asked. So in this case, I've saved it into username, and then I'm going to send it to my goodbye function. Okay, say goodbye, and I send it username. And now it can do what it is. Thanks for using my program, so-and-so. And we've made it tidy. So see, all these lines of code here, nothing too complicated, but boy does it make it really simple when we look at our main, and now our main is 3 lines of code. And what you often see is people, you can click these right here and shrink them down. And so now, you know, I don't even have to think about these until unless I need to make a change or make a little adjustment. So if I run my program real quick, you can see how it is. It says, welcome to my program. Please tell me your name. Well, my name is, I'll have a more fun name. How about Taco Wagon? Thanks for using my program, Taco Wagon. Great. And I tested it using a space, right? Because I wanted to make sure that it worked with a space. That was one of the reasons that I used getLine. And so if my name is just Chris, thanks for using my program, Chris. Great. I tested it in both cases. Both cases work. I feel great. So hopefully this was pretty useful for you as a way to introduce these functions. Thanks a lot. Have a good time coding.